Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in today. We are going to continue on our reading of the Seth material. This is the Bodega Cat Book Club. And today we're going to be reading chapter 16. All right, let's get to it. Here we go. Chapter 16, the multidimensional personality. Not too long ago, a young psychology professor called and asked me to speak to his class at a local college. It was a small group of about 15 students, so I suggested that they come to my apartment instead. The man's attitude was apparent the minute he came in the door. Personally, he wouldn't touch a medium with a 10-foot pole. But since they did exist and he knew of one, he felt duty-bound to expose his students to the phenomenon. And undoubtedly, he patted himself on the back for his broad-mindedness. For 2.5 hours, I spoke on the potentials of human personality and the necessity of recognizing, developing, and using them. To the best of my ability, I explained what telepathy, clairvoyance, and precognition were, and what experiments might be conducted to show them in operation. Finally, I suggested an exercise to be done by the students, such as we sometimes use in my own classes. The target sketch was to be tacked on the inside of my door each day. The girls would try to pick up an impression of the target, drawing and reproducing it. I would mail my drawings to the professor at the end of the allotted time, and he would judge the hits and misses for himself. Carefully, I thought. Okay, sorry about that. I'll make sure that you guys can see it. Okay. Carefully, I thought. I explained that suggestion was very important and asked the professor to have an objective attitude during the tests. But as I later discovered through one of his students, his attitude was anything but objective and hardly scientific. He let the class know through his statements and general behavior that he thought such tests were beneath serious consideration. Oddly enough, the results weren't bad at all, but his attitude was so poor that only 5 girls took part in the experiment. I suggested that he try the experiment too, but he wouldn't. And his attitude discouraged enough students so that he could say later that the low number participating made test results impossible to evaluate. He dismissed all of the hits made as coincidence. The professor was intelligent, personable, earnest. Had we met under different circumstances, I probably would have liked him. But he didn't want to reconsider or evaluate his preconceived ideas of the nature of personality. He missed an opportunity to broaden his outlook and perhaps to find the kind of evidence that would convince him that human personality was far less limited than he supposed. This episode had a few similar ones have made me wary of such encounters with so-called objective academicians. But all psychologists aren't so narrow-minded and intellectually rigid. Last year, one of my students was taking a psychology course in the local college night sessions, and with the professor's encouragement, she frequently discussed Seth and our ESP classes. My student wanted to do one of her required papers on the nature of personality as explained by Seth. She asked Seth if he could give a special session for this purpose. She wanted to record it and play it for the college class. Seth agreed and devoted one entire class to the session. He had some interesting things to say about his own reality, too. In a way, it's not the kind of in-depth discussion Seth would give in one of our private sessions, but it contains an excellent thumbnail description of his theories on personality. For those who have no previous knowledge of the Seth material, for that reason, I'll use excerpts from it to open this chapter. There were about 10 of my regular students at the session. Seth was at his best, smiling, often breaking up serious material with a few light jokes or comments. Most of the time, he spoke directly to the student who requested the session or addressed the 60 members of her psychology class who were not present. The whole session ran about 6 single-typed pages. Seth began by saying, "Identity is not the same as personality. Personality represents only those aspects of identity that you're able to actualize within three-dimensional existence. Personality may be molded by circumstances in your terms, but identity uses the experiences and is not swept willy-nilly. It is true that there are no limitations to the self, and in one respect, you can say that the self reaches out to encompass the environment. Current theories regarding the nature of personality do not take into consideration the existence of telepathy or clairvoyance, or the fact reincarnation. What you have, in effect, is a one-dimensional psychology. Identity operates in many dimensions, however. When Seth addressed the members of the college class for whom the recording, then Seth addressed the members of the college class for whom the recording would be played. We all thought later that this session was hilarious in one way, a personality invisible in our terms, addressing an absent psychology class on the nature of personality. Yet Seth certainly knew what he was doing, for he used his own unorthodox method of communication as a case in point. You have here in the session itself a provocative demonstration of the nature of personality, he said. For my personality is not Rupert's, nor is his mine. I am not a secondary personality, for instance. I make no attempt to dominate Rupert's life, nor indeed would I expect him to allow it. I do not represent any repressed portions of Rupert's own being. For those here know, he is hardly the repressed type on his own. I have helped him in that his own personality operates more effectively. He's able to use his own abilities more fully, and that is hardly a psychological crime. The facts are, dear psychology class and professor, that all of you are more than you know. Each of you exists in other realities and other dimensions, and the self that you call yourself is but a small portion of your entire identity. Now, in dreams, you do have contact with other parts of yourself. The communication goes on constantly, but your ego is so focused upon physical reality and survival within it that you do not hear the inner voice. You must realize that what you are cannot be seen in a mirror. What you see in a mirror is but a dim reflection of your true reality. You do not see your ego in the mirror. You do not see your subconscious. You do not see the inner self in a mirror. These are but terms to express the part of you that cannot be seen or touched. But within the selves that you know is the prime identity, the whole inner self, this whole self has lived many lives. It has adopted many personalities. It is an energy essence personality, even as I am. The only difference is that I am not materialized within physical matter. You do not suddenly acquire a spirit at death. You are one now. Then, smiling, Seth went further into the question of his own existence and mine. He began by stating that he had always cautioned me to maintain a good balance between solitude and activity. Then he spoke to the professor of the psychology class. You may, if you wish, call me a subconscious production. I do not particularly enjoy such a designation since it is not true. But if you do call me a subconscious extension of Rupert's own personality, then you must agree that the subconscious is telepathic and clairvoyant, since I have shown telepathic and clairvoyant abilities. So, may I remind you, as Rupert on his own, however, unless you are willing to assign to the subconscious those abilities, and most of your colleagues do not, then I cannot be considered to have such a subconscious origin. If you are willing to concede the point, then I have other arguments. My memories are not the memories of a young woman. My mind is not a young woman's mind. I have been used to many occupations, and Rupert has no memory of them. I'm not a father, image of Rupert's, nor am I the male figure that lurks in the back of the female mind. Nor does our friend Rupert have homosexual tendencies. I am simply an energy essence personality, no longer materialized in physical form. Personality and identity are not dependent upon physical form. It is only because you think they are that you find this sort of performance so strange. You adopt a body as a space traveler wears a spacesuit, and for much the same reason. The psychology class was as much interested in Seth's reality as in the nature of personality, as he well knew. Smiling, Seth said, one other point. These sessions are scheduled and therefore operate under controlled conditions. Rupert's own personality is in no way threatened by them, and his ego has been carefully coddled and protected. It has not been shunted aside. Instead, it has been taught new abilities. I was not artificially brought to birth through hypnosis. There was no artificial tampering of personality characteristics here. There was no hysteria. Rupert allows me to use the nervous system under highly controlled conditions. I am not given a blanket permission to take over when I please, nor would I desire such an agreement. I have other things to do. As far as I can see, Seth's reference to hypnosis had to do with the training undergone by some mediums in which hypnosis is used to initiate and stabilize the trance state, and occasionally to call forth the communications of controlled personalities. This didn't happen in my case. The whole thing was spontaneous. Although I know how to use self-hypnosis now, having studied it in the past several years, I've never used it for a session. Seth ended this discussion by outlining various ways to develop awareness of the inner self. This material will be given in a later chapter. My student played the tape during her next college class, and since it ran longer than the allotted time, the psychology professor and some of the students went to her house later to hear the whole tape and discuss it. Seth's personality, of course, comes through on one tape better than on the printed tape because his inflections and connotations are obvious. Also, we recorded a few moments of conversation so that my normal voice could be compared with Seth's. Even the most lecture-like private session is always enlivened by Seth's gestures, and this is more marked when he is relating to a group. Granted, we survived death. What part of us survives? As Seth gave us more material on reincarnation and the inner self, we naturally wondered. Having a whole self may be great, but if my Jane Roberts self is engulfed by it after death, then to me, that's not much of a survival. It's like saying that a little fish survives when it's eaten by a bigger one because it becomes a part of it. But according to Seth, no individuality is ever lost. It is always in existence. The tricky point here is that the self has no boundaries, except those it accepts out of ignorance. Our individual consciousness grows, and out of its experience, it forms different personalities or fragments of itself. These fragments, Jane Roberts is one of them, are entirely independent as to action and decision. Yet the inner psychic components are constantly in communication with the whole self of which they are part. These fragments themselves grow, develop, and may form their own entities or personality gestalts, or if you prefer, whole souls. Seth says that even in this life, each of us has various egos. We only accept the idea of one ego as a sort of shorthand symbolism. The ego at any given time in this life is simply the part of us that surfaces, a group of characteristics that the inner self uses to solve various problems. Even the ego, as we think of it, changes constantly. For example, the Jane Roberts of now is different from the Jane Roberts of 10 years ago, though I have not been conscious of any particular change of identity. My own experiences convince me that I'm more than my normal self. The self I refer to as me. In getting clairvoyant information, for instance, some part of me knows what the Jane part ordinarily does not. This portion of me communicates the knowledge to the Jane ego. I believe that this happens not only in the case of ESP, but also in connection with artistic inspiration. We tune into more knowledgeable portions of our own identities. Of course, these abilities don't mean much unless you learn to use them and experience them for yourself. Early in our session, Seth described what he calls the inner senses, inner methods of perception that expand normal consciousness and allow us to become aware of our own multidimensional existence. It was some time before we fully understood what these meant and how we could use them, and we are still learning to use them more effectively. I'm going to take a drink of my tea here for a minute. Okay. As mentioned earlier, Seth said to us in sessions was also backed up by what happened to them in them. As he spoke about latent potentials, we found ourselves discovering our own. To a large extent, then, our personal experiences corroborated Seth's theories. For example, session 138 on March 8, 1965 is a case in point. That night, Seth was just beginning his material on personality as action. The ideas he presented are basic to his overall theories of identity. And since he deals with some of the characteristics of consciousness, they are also a basis of later material on the God concept. At the time, we were having sessions in the bedroom, which is small, with one window looking out on a large yard. It was summer, hardly anyone knew of the sessions yet, and Seth's full voice rising out on the nighttime air would have raised questions we weren't ready to answer. As he has done since the beginning, Rob sat with pen and paper, taking verbatim notes. He often felt quite warm, since we closed the window to keep the sessions as private as possible, particularly since neighbors were often sitting in the yard. The heat never bothers me when I'm in trance, although otherwise I'm very susceptible to it. Reading the excerpts, you can see that Seth did give hints as to what was to come. Some of you reading between the lines may even guess what was in store for us. Identity may be termed action, which is conscious of itself. For the purposes of our discussion, the terms action and identity must be separated, but basically no such separation exists. And identity is also a dimension of existence, action within action, an unfolding of action upon itself. And through this interweaving of action with itself, through this reaction, an identity is formed. The energy of action, the workings of action within and upon itself forms identity, yet through identity is formed from action. Action and identity cannot be separated. Identity then is action's effect upon itself. Without identity, action would be meaningless, for there would be nothing upon which action could act. Action must, by its very nature, of itself and its own workings, create identities. This applies from the most simple to the most complex. Once more, action is not a force from without that acts upon matter. Action is instead the inside validity of the inner universe. It is the dilemma between inner vitality's desire and impetus to completely materialize itself and its inability to completely do so. This first dilemma results in action. And from action's own workings upon itself, we have seen that identity was formed and that these two are inseparable. Action is therefore a part of all structure. Action having of itself and because of its nature formed identity, now also because of its nature would seem to destroy identity. Since action must involve change, and any change seems to threaten identity. It is a mistaken notion, however, that identity is dependent upon stability. Identity, because of its characteristics, will continually seek stability, while stability is impossible. This is our second dilemma. It is this dilemma between identity's constant attempts to maintain stability in action's inherent drive for change that results in the imbalance, the exquisite creative byproduct that is unconscious of itself. That is consciousness of its. Okay, let's do this again. It is this dilemma between identity's constant attempts to maintain stability and to action's inherent drive for change that results in the imbalance, the exquisite creative byproduct that is consciousness of self. For consciousness and existence do not result from delicate balances, so much as they are made possible by lack of balances, so richly creative that there would be no reality were balance ever maintained. We have a series of creative strains. Identity must seek stability, while action must seek change. Yet identity could not exist without change, for it is the reason of action and a part of it. Identities are never constant, as you yourselves are not the same consciously or unconsciously from one moment to the next. Every action is a termination, as we discussed earlier. And yet, without the termination, identity would cease to exist. For consciousness without action would cease to be conscious. Consciousness, therefore, is not a thing in itself. It is a dimension of action, an almost miraculous state made possible by what I choose to call a series of creative dilemmas. It should be fairly easy to see how the second dilemma evolved from the first. I have said that the second one resulted in, and constantly results in, consciousness of self. This is not ego consciousness. Consciousness of self is still consciousness directly connected with action. Ego consciousness is a state resulting from the third creative dilemma, which happens when consciousness of self attempts to separate itself from action. Since this is obviously impossible, since no consciousness or identity can exist without action, we have the third dilemma. Boy, a lot of tongue twisters here. Again, consciousness of self involves a consciousness of self within and as a part of action. Ego consciousness, on the other hand, involves a state in which consciousness of self attempts to divorce self from action, an attempt on the part of consciousness to perceive action as an object, and to perceive action as initiated by the ego as a result, rather than as a cause of ego's own existence. These three dilemmas represent three areas of reality within which inner vitality can experience itself. And here also we have the reason why inner vitality can never achieve complete materialization. The very action involved in vitality's attempt to materialize itself adds to the inner dimension of vitality itself. Action, inner vitality, can never complete itself, materializing in any form whatsoever. It at once multiplies the possibility of further materialization. At the same time, because inner vitality is self-generating, only a minute fraction of it is needed to seed a universe. In line with the statement made earlier that action necessarily changes that which it acts upon, which is basically itself, then it follows that the action involved in our session changes the nature of the sessions. I have spoken of consciousness as the direction in which the self focuses. Action implies infinite possibilities of focus. As Seth delivered the material you have just read, I had a series of continued experiences that were new to me. I couldn't tell Rob about them until our breaks, of course, and indeed they are nearly impossible to describe. The nearest I can come is to say that as this information was being given verbally to Rob, it was given to me in a different way also. I seemed to be inside action, drifting through various dimensions. I felt what Seth was saying, as if the words were translated into subjective experience. It was more like being swept along into something else than being, say, negated. My ego wasn't lost, but became part of the concepts Seth was talking about. I was inside them, looking out. Toward the end of the session, Rob asked Seth if he'd explain what was happening. Seth said, Rupert is experiencing action gestalts. Like every other consciousness, he is action. But this evening, he is experiencing action to some small degree without the ego's usual attempt to separate itself from action. I mentioned in our last discussion that this material would be the basis of future sessions. It is true that another dimension has been added to the sessions, and I hope to instruct Rupert along the lines of more direct perception as we continue. I told you that such developments could be expected. These are natural unfoldings and will continue according to their own nature and in their own time. I expect that this latest development will involve still another. This sort of thing began to happen frequently in sessions. Later, we took it for granted, I guess, without realizing what an impression it made on us the first time. My experiences usually parallel whatever information Seth is giving. According to Seth, this involves the use of the inner senses, and my experiences are meant to point up the existence of these abilities not only in me, but as the latent capabilities of each of each personality. Okay, I'm going to stop here, pause here for a minute, and I will be back. I'm just going to take a little break. Okay, let's continue here. Where was I? Okay, so let's start up here. This sort of thing began to happen frequently in sessions. Later, we took it for granted, I guess, without realizing what an impression it made on us the first time. My experiences usually parallel whatever information Seth is giving. According to Seth, this involves the use of the inner senses, and my experiences are meant to point up the existence of these abilities, not only in me, but as the latent capabilities of each personality. Seth says that the physical body and its senses are specialized equipment to allow us to live in physical reality. To perceive other realities, we have to use the inner senses, methods of perception that belong to the inner self, and operate whether or not we have a physical form. Seth calls the universe as we know it a camouflage system. Since physical matter is simply the form that vitality, action, takes within it. Other realities are also camouflage systems, and within them, consciousness also has specialized equipment tailored to their peculiar characteristics, but the inner senses allow us to see beneath the camouflage. These inner senses belong to the whole selves of which we are part. Each whole self helps and inspires its personalities. Starting with the personality as we usually think of it, there is, after the operating ego, a layer of personal subconscious material. Beneath this is racial material dealing with the species as a whole. Beneath this, undistorted and yours for the asking, is the knowledge inherent in the inner self pertaining to reality as a whole, its laws, principles, and composition. Here you will find the innate knowledge concerning the creation of the camouflage universe as you know it, the mechanics involved, and much of the material I have given you. You will find the ways and means by which the inner self, existing in the climate of psychological reality, helps create the various planes of existence, constructs outer senses to project and perceive these, and the ways by which reincarnations take place within various systems. Here you will find your own answers as to how the inner self transforms energy for its own purposes, changes its form, and adopts other realities. Quite a mouthful. No kidding. What Seth is saying is that each of us can reach the inner self, that the inner senses help us to perceive other than three-dimensional reality, and that we can get to this knowledge with determination and training. We start with ourselves and travel through our own subjective experience, working from the ego inward. The physical senses help us to perceive exterior reality that we know. The inner senses let us perceive the inner ones. To some extent, Rob and I have experienced most of these inner senses to some degree. Take a fairly simple one, psychological time. Seth says, from within its framework, you will see that physical time is as dreamlike as you once thought inner time was. You will discover your whole selves peeping inward and outward at the same time, and find that all time is one time and all divisions illusions. When we do psych time, as Rob and I call it, our experiences seem to take place outside of the usual time frame. It's like shifting gears. So that perception happens in a different context. Psych time is the time I traveled in when I'm projecting, for example. When I went to California in the episode mentioned in chapter 9, over 6,000 miles were covered in a half hour. Obviously, in normal time, this would be impossible. A deeper appreciation of the subject requires more information about the real nature of time, however, because according to Seth, the inner self operates not within time as we know it, but through perceptions that largely ignore time as we know it. The question comes up then, how can we ignore time? What is there about ourselves or time that we can disconnect one from the other? Some of you may not be interested in such questions, but others will feel cheated if they are left unanswered. Seth does not ignore such issues, and I'm closing this chapter with a few excerpts in which he considers them. Here, Seth partially explains the nature of time and shows why we are basically free of it. From session 224, The Personality and Time. The past exists as a series of electromagnetic connections held in the physical brain and in the non-physical mind. These electromagnetic connections can be changed. The future consists of a series of electromagnetic connections in the mind and brain also, and this is the only reality that you are justified in giving the present. In other words, the past and present are real to the same extent. On occasion, the past can become more real than the present, and in such cases, past actions are reacted to in what you call the present. You take it for granted for present action to change the future, but present actions can also change the past. The past is no more objective or independent from the perceiver than it is the present. These electromagnetic connections that compose the past were largely made by individual perceiver, and the perceiver is always a participator. The connections, therefore, can be changed, and such changes are far from uncommon. They happen spontaneously on a subconscious basis. The past is seldom what you remember it to be, for you have already rearranged it from the instant of any given event. The past is being constantly recreated by each individual as attitudes and associations change. This is an actual recreation, not a symbolic one. The child is indeed still within the man, but he is not the child that was, for even the child within the man constantly changes. Difficulties arise, in fact, when such alterations do not occur automatically. Severe neurosis is often caused precisely because the individual has not changed his past. Once more, the only reality that can be assigned to the past is that granted to the symbols and associations and images that exist electromagnetically within the physical brain and non-physical mind. I'm speaking in your terms now, and this should be understood as I'm simplifying conditions considerably. A change of attitude, a new association, or any of the innumerable other actions will automatically set up new electromagnetic connections and break others. Every action changes every other actions. We go back to our ABCs. Therefore, every action in your present affects those actions you call past. Ripples from a thrown stone go out in all directions, and I'm going out rather far on the limb myself up right here. Remembering what you know of the nature of time, you realize that the apparent boundaries between past, present, and future are only illusions caused by the amount of action you can physically perceive. Therefore, it is possible to react in the past to an event that has not yet occurred, to be influenced by your own future. It is also possible for an individual to react in the past to an event in the future, which may never occur in your terms. I'm sure you remember the couple you saw in York Beach. This episode was described in chapter 2. Yes, Rob said, looking up. Now, this couple represented a sort of time projection, for literally you could have become what they were. This existed in that present as a probability. You perceive that portion of the probable future and reacted to it. And the possible transformation of yourselves into those images did not occur. Because past, present, and future exist simultaneously, there is no reason why you cannot react to an event, whether or not it happens to fall within the small field of reality in which you usually observe and participate. On a subconscious level, you react to many events that have not yet occurred, as far as your egotistical awareness is concerned. Such reactions are carefully screened out and not admitted to consciousness. The ego finds such instances distracting and annoying, and when forced to admit their validity, will resort to the most far-fetched rationalizations to explain them. The inner self can, indeed, perceive events that will occur after physical death. It never was imprisoned by ego time. Its perceptions are merely inhibited by the ego. The inner self can perceive events that will occur to itself after death, and those in which it is not involved. In all of these instances, however, there are uncertainties, for probable events can be seen as clearly as events that will physically happen. No event is predestined. Any given event can be changed, not only before and during, but after its occurrence. Again, I am not speaking symbolically, and I realize that I'm leaving myself open to strong criticisms that certainly cannot be answered in this one evening. There are, for example, limitations set here that must be clearly stated, but within these limitations, you will find that events can be changed and are constantly changed, regardless of the apparent point of their original happening. All of this applies unless, of course, an individual is taken completely out of physical time system. A murdered man will not be returned whole and intact to physical life, though he may return as a spirit believing he is still alive. In summation, the individual is hardly at the mercy of past events, for he changes them constantly. He is hardly at the mercy of future events, for he changes these not only before but after their happening. Again, the past is as real as the future, no more or no less. For the past exists only as a pattern of electromagnetic currents within the mind and brain, and these constantly change. An individual's future actions are not dependent upon a concrete finished past, for such a past never existed. We were to discover that these ideas were not just theoretical. In the following chapter, I'll tell you one of the strangest experiences of my life, one in which I was swept out of the world of time and space, and then just as suddenly thrown back into it again. Boy, this is a very convoluted chapter. Brain twister for sure. All right, end of chapter 16. Thank you so much for joining us. And next week, we will continue with chapter 17. In the meantime, have a great day, have a great week, and we will see you back again next time. Bye-bye now.